Hi, Richard Steenan here. I'm Chief Research Analyst for IT Harvest, and I'm going to give you my presentation that I'm making at the RSA Security Conference 2016, IT Security Industry Real Trends. Before we dive into some of the data that I've finally pulled together after many years, I want to address uh, two factors and two misconceptions about our industry. And first off is that there is no IT security industry consolidation. For some reason, you cannot see an article published on some new acquisition or M&A activity in the IT security space without the journalists throwing in there the fact that this is a further sign of industry consolidation. This has been going on for as long as I've been in the industry, 25 years. There's constant M&A activity in IT security, and yet the number of total vendors is growing all the time. Mature industries consolidate. So you've got hotels, the chains all get together. Auto industry went through a consolidation phase. Storage went through a consolidation phase. The security industry won't consolidate until the threat actors go home. The other thing I want to point out is that growth in IT security is seriously misstated by most of the firms that track the industry. You can't grow from a $2.5 billion industry in 2003, where most of the firms pegged it, to an $85 billion industry in 2013 at the 9% compound annual growth rate that most firms have talked about over the last decade or more. That's a 34% compound annual growth rate. Even in 2015, Gartner came out and said that that the cybersecurity industry was going to grow at 4.7%. The reality is much, much different. It's much, much greater. The industry is growing today at about 24%, and I believe it'll continue to grow at 24% over the next decade. What does that look like? And what are the drivers for that? Keep in mind that IT security is the only technology industry that has an outside driver. Most technologies are driven by innovation, reduced costs, faster speeds, and more features. So everyone in that industry is constantly struggling to reduce the cost, make their things go faster, and to add features. So there's competitive growth, there's innovation going on, but they don't have what cybersecurity has, and that's the threat actor. They're driving the need for security spending. Without the threat actors, we wouldn't need all of this security spending. If you looked at that 2003 timeframe when the industry was only $2.5 billion, that was money spent on basically firewalls, IDS, and antivirus. And it was all to stop hacking activity from people who just were breaking into things because they could, because you were vulnerable. They did. And then we saw the rise of cybercrime. And all of a sudden, the industry kind of pivoted, the threat actor industry pivoted into taking advantage of those vulnerable systems in order to steal banking credentials and steal money from your bank account or your credit card. And then they expanded into the fraud that we see going on, Nigerian 419 scam artists, all the rest was pretty much what was going on in the first years of the century. And then we started to see nation states get engaged. So the actual, first APT style attack was seen by Lockheed Martin in 2003. It was part of a series of attacks that the FBI dubbed Titan Rain, and that just saw all the growth that we've experienced up till now. Remember the famous APT-1 report, Advanced Persistent Threat, that Mandiant put out only 3 years ago. That was just the level of sophistication in these types of nation state attacks. And also in the last several years, we've seen attacks against countries from one country to another. Russia against Estonia, Russia against Georgia, Iran, at least hackers against Saudi Arabia and the United States. So as these nation state level events grow, so does the security spending. But the big change, and the reason that led me to my predictions of future growth at similar rates, was the discovery by most of us, thanks to Edward Snowden, that we actually had an adversary that was much better financed than anything we had ever conceived of before. And that was the intelligence communities of various countries, particularly the United States, England, Australia, and Canada, who are systematically taking advantage of a intelligence windfall because most people weren't encrypting data. Most organizations weren't encrypting data. As a matter of fact, Google and Yahoo weren't encrypting their data centers or the traffic that flowed between them. And the intelligence community was tapping into that and basically stealing a lot of data. And of course, predictably, and certainly as I predicted, the industry is responding. We've got technology that can counter even this threat, I believe. And that involves spending a lot more on encryption, as Yahoo, Microsoft, Google have worked in the last 3 years to encrypt their entire cloud infrastructure, all of their data stores, and all the communications between them. Of course, encryption is relatively inexpensive to deploy. We can do that. The hard part with encryption, as always, is key management, generating keys and revoking keys and storing them in a safe place. And it's that storage that is going to be the driving, that protecting your encryption keys is going to drive security industry growth because, of course, in the intelligence community, these spy agencies have decades of experience cracking encryption and trying to get at the communications and the signals intelligence that they're after. And invariably, they don't do that by breaking the encryption, but they do that by stealing the keys. So in order to protect those keys, we're going to have to spend on all of the things that IT security has been doing forever, and that includes firewalls and all the network security, identity and access management, strong two-factor authentication, the data encryption, all the rest that goes into protecting those keys is the spending that is going to be required going forward. So 24% annual growth rate compounds pretty quickly to, by 2023, I'm predicting $640 billion in global annual spending on security. Huge numbers. And in the meantime, the number of vendors is growing. It's a full-time task on the part of myself and my team to keep up on all those vendors. We learn of new ones every single day. At this point in time, we pay at 1,325 vendors, broken down into about 80 categories. We've seen security vendors in 35 countries, and here in the United States in 37 states. So let's just quickly take a look at that data, just to demonstrate, because I've been questioned on Twitter that I actually have that data. Please feel free to go to IT Harvest, where I'll be publishing this in various report formats. And here's the actual spreadsheet. So 1,300 vendors, I've broken them down here, sorted them on the major buckets, which are network, IAM, governance, risk, and compliance, and endpoint security, plus a lot of smaller buckets. So a lot of vendors. And I'm scrolling through them here. This is probably the one of the few ways I can actually expose the entire database without saving somebody the months of effort it took for us to put this together. So this is my IP that I'm finding extremely valuable just since we've finally pulled it all together. So back to the presentation. 1,325 vendors. How do they break down by country? Well, the US, not surprisingly, is the dominant country for IT security. 856 security vendors in the United States alone. Israel is a far second, with almost a quarter of that number with 114. I'm sorry, almost an eighth of that number with 114. UK after them with 82, and then you've got Canada with 48. And then you've got European countries, Germany and France, 33 and 25, even India, which is actually getting a growing number of security vendors pretty quickly. Now, I expect this graph to fatten out a little in its tail, in that post Snowden, there's movement for each country to have its own IT security vendors. It's not quite a logical thing, but if you're in Germany and you feel like you can't trust a firewall vendor from the United States because you suspect that the NSA has secret agreements with them to put backdoors, why then you have your own firewall vendor? Now, of course, now you have to worry about your own country intelligence services putting backdoors into those pieces of equipment as well. But needless to say, I believe there'll be more IT security vendors as we see some of this um, fractalization of the market occurring. So let's drill down into the United States, where we break it down by number of vendors per state. California has 328 security vendors. It's almost 25% of all the vendors in the world are actually in California. Vast majority of them in the Bay Area. The other concentration is around San Diego. Followed by the Washington, D.C. region with 91 vendors, so that's Maryland and Virginia and D.C. proper. Followed by the Boston area with 69 vendors, and then Texas with 52. And then in the chart, I filled out some of the other ones: New York, Florida, Georgia, surprisingly, with only 27 vendors in it, and yet you'll see news reports coming out of Georgia that they actually have 115 vendors. I've dug into it, and I can't find that many in Georgia. Maybe historically there have been more vendors, but a lot of them have been acquired from ISS to Landcope and aren't technically in Georgia companies anymore. And then you get all the way down to Michigan with 18 IT security vendors. That actually surprised me. Even though I've been in Michigan over 35 years, I didn't realize we had that many vendors. I'll have to go talk to them. And who can resist if you've got all the data in a database, sorting it by first letter? And certainly, as we were doing our research, we recognized that there sure were a lot of S's. We hated every time we had to get to the S's to fill out our data. With 172 companies under the S's, under C, 154 companies. That's a new development because of all the cyber companies that have started up in the last 3 or 4 years. The little blip under I is because of all the identity vendors. And that also accounts for the A's too, where you have all the authorization and authentication vendors showing up. So 22 companies with cyber in their name. I'm sure most of them created in the last 5 years or less. And then how does this break down by types of vendors and market size? So my market size numbers are estimates based on the current 105 billion industry that I peg the entire global market for security products at. We've got the largest bucket is network security vendors, 230 of them and $29 billion. And then you've got the IAM, Identity and Access Management vendors, 211 of them, smaller market, about half the size of network security. But there's so many vendors in that space because of all the authentication techniques. So you've got dozens of vendors that do various biometrics, be they voice or gait or fingerprints, or the way you type on your keyboard. All those biometric types of vendors are there, as well as all the password management solutions. So that gives you quite a lot of vendors. Endpoint, which is the second biggest bucket at just under 21 billion, only has 134 vendors in it, but you have to realize that there's some very large vendors in there because that's where Symantec, Intel with their McAfee acquisition, Trend Micro, even Sophos sit, and of course Kaspersky, who's private, but probably does $1 billion a year in revenue. So you've got maybe 6 or 8 extremely large vendors in that space. plus another dozen that are doing over 100 million a year in the regional endpoint security antivirus companies, and then tons and tons of startups who are trying to just fix this problem that signature-based antivirus apparently isn't addressing. And I got to ask you, if the industry is consolidating, then why are there 134 endpoint security vendors? You'd think maybe there's room for 4 or 5 in a mature industry, and it's just because the industry is not mature. Threat actors are pushing us further and further, and we need better and better technology. Data security is the bucket for all the encryption and PKI products. 169 vendors in that. The reason there's so many vendors is because of all the startups in secure private communications. So all of your secure messaging apps, your secure videos, secure voice, um, all of that falls into that $15.7 billion bucket. And then the smallest bucket is governance, risk, and compliance. 190 vendors in that. And the reason even that there are so many vendors is I throw in most of the log management and SIM vendors qualify in my mind as more compliance vendors and security vendors, as well as the vulnerability management vendors. So, very mature industry. It's been around forever, um, but it fits into GRC. So if all of the things I've been saying here are true, how will you change your plans for 2016 and beyond? Knowing that the number of vendors is increasing, global spending is increasing at 24%. What are you doing with your own budgets, your own hiring plans, your own training plans? How are you going to accommodate growth inside your IT security team of 24% a year? Most organizations, if anything, spend 5 to 7% of their total IT budget. So that's going to have to increase. It's going to have to increase to 12% or more, and a lot of that may be folded into the deployment of new projects and new products because you're going to be spending money on software assurance and authentication and encryption. So that spending will be part of that. If the security industry is going to be $640 billion just 7 years from now, how is that going to change your investment focus? Maybe you want to put some of your 401k into security companies because they're doing very well right now and bound to do extremely well over the next decade. And what about security conferences? Are there going to be 24% more security conferences, or are the ones we have just going to grow bigger? And for that matter, is RSA going to quickly outgrow all of the facilities that Moscone can provide and have to find a new home in not too many years?